This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell and Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in state government. And on this episode, we're examining who is wielding the most power in the state legislature, or at least who are the effective state lawmakers here at the Capitol in Albany. And it's an important question because while all 213 members of New York State Legislature can introduce a bill, it's the effective ones who get them across the finish line. But how do you judge effectiveness? Can it be meaningfully quantified? Well, the Center for Effective Lawmaking, a partnership between the universities of Virginia and Vanderbilt, has been working on this issue since 2017, and as part of their effort to assess the 99 state legislative chambers around the country, recently put out a report on the most effective lawmakers here in New York for the 2023 and 2024 sessions. And we're going to hear from them and unpack their methodology, as well as potentially get some tips for the future of our Planet Albany Fantasy Lawmaker League. And to do all that, we're joined by Craig Volden, co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking and a professor at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at UVA, as well as the co-author of Legislative Effectiveness in the United States Congress, the Lawmakers. Thank you so much for making the time, Craig. I really look forward to this conversation.
Great to be with you, David.
I want to start with the why of it all, because I understand from a lobbyist perspective why I would want to know who's effective, or even from a voter's perspective why I would want to know if my elected official is good at getting stuff done. But what made your organization, and maybe you specifically, interested in this broader question about who are the effective lawmakers?
Yeah, this is a question that appealed to us, my co-author on all of this, Alan Wiseman at Vanderbilt, and I, for the past 20 years or so. You know, back then we were saying there are a lot of ways that people are like measuring who's really liberal or really conservative in Congress. We were focused on Congress alone at that point in time, but not much in terms of who actually gets things done. It's not always the moderates or the conservatives or the liberals who are most effective. Is there any way we can systematically measure that and start to get our handle on, you know, what does it mean to be an effective lawmaker, and potentially, how could we promote effective lawmaking in Congress and the states? And so that led us to develop what we refer to as legislative effectiveness scores, that we can objectively score members. Some are better at moving their legislation through the lawmaking process than others. And then we can kind of use those scores to really study the process. You know, what could a lawmaker do to become more effective? Who are the folks who, if they were to choose to run for a legislature, are going to be well positioned to be effective there? And as you note, on the far end, do voters hold members accountable for their level of effectiveness?
Yeah, and in terms of New York, the conclusion that you reached seemed to be similar to what you found in other state legislatures and in the United States Congress more broadly, which is that, boy, it's helpful to be in the majority. Boy, it's helpful to have been around for a while. And hey, if you're a committee chair, that's usually indicative of your ability to get things through the legislature. So was it fair to say that across both chambers, the Senate and Assembly, you found some commonality with other states, or did anything stand out to you about New York?
Yeah, I think that's right. So all three of those factors, being a committee chair, being in the majority party, being more senior, are associated with lawmaking effectiveness, according to our metrics. That's true in almost every state. It's also true in New York. That said, the degree to which those considerations matter varies a lot from state to state and over time. So, a couple things that we noted for New York relative to other states is in the assembly, just the level to which committee chairs are high performers. So we released a top 10 list, and they're all committee chairs in New York, and that's not true in most states. And so that tells us a little bit about, where does power lie and what does it take to move things forward. In terms of the majority party versus the minority party, we saw kind of an interesting pattern in the Senate. So we set our scores to average out at a value of 1. So you get a 0 if you introduce no bills, but you work your way up to an average of 1 or much higher, depending on your bills and how far they move through the process and whether they're tackling the biggest issues of the day. And given that average of 1, we kind of are interested in, well, what's the average for members of the minority party? And in the Senate in New York, the average minority party member gets about a 0.5. So they're not as effective, not able to influence legislation as much. But then we looked back in time and, 10 to 20 years ago in the Senate, when it was closely contested between Democrats and Republicans, the average score in the minority party was only a 0.2.
Well, how did you account then for, as you said, the chamber was very closely aligned, and there was a point where Republicans were actually co-sharing with Democrats, so there were Democrats who actually got bills across the finish line. So did that skew your numbers at all because there were a handful of Democrats who actually had committee chairs under the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how that works in these closely divided chambers. But the broadest point that we're able to find across lots of states, in New York then is just an example of this, is the degree to which, when there's a close minority party, the majority party doesn't want them to succeed, doesn't want to give them any credit for moving legislation forward, doesn't want to give them a platform on which they could build into the majority party next time. And so only when that seems to no longer be at risk is the minority party let back into the process. And now, not as seemingly full and equal members because they're not averaging anywhere near a 1, but just sort of seeing that play out over time in New York in the Senate in particular was fascinating to us.
Well, let's get into the metrics you used. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we have a fantasy lawmaker league now where political nerds draft 6 lawmakers. They get points based on what happens with their bills. And I'm scoring teams based on the movements of bills because that's the data I have easiest access to, and it's the easiest data to crunch. You seem to take that same basic approach while also scoring based on, quote, how substantial their policy proposals are. How did you go about trying to assess the substantive nature of policy proposals, especially in a chamber that's moving, I think, 800 bills through both houses, and say 20,000 are going to get introduced in 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was a major task as we moved from Congress to the state legislatures. Each state is different, and so our overall scores are based on 5 lawmaking stages. Just how many bills does somebody introduce? Do those bills get some sort of attention or action in committee? And that'll vary by the state. Every bill gets a committee hearing. Some states are quite different from that. How many of them reached the floor of their home chamber? How many passed their home chamber? And how many became law? So we get rarer and rarer things, and we score more highly for those rarer activities. But then in terms of how do we upgrade or downgrade bills? This is something that we ported over from how we were looking at Congress. Commemorative bills in Congress, that's naming of post offices, but in the states, there are a variety of commemorative activities get downgraded.
Just to interject, so would that be something like you might name a bridge after a veteran or something in New York?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's right. Right in line with that. It matters, but it's commemorative in nature, and so those are downgraded for us. The middle category is most bills. They deal with a variety of substantive issues. And then our top category is what we refer to as substantive and significant bills. And those are ones that get a lot of media attention, are picked up by a variety of good governance organizations that are focused on what's going on in the states and so on.
And how did you go about doing all of that? Do you have like a team of interns who are scrolling through each bills? Are you doing some sort of automated reading of bills and looking for certain key words? Because that does not sound like a lot of fun if you're a human being that has to do that work.
It is fun for a subset of computer programmers and political science nerds, and so absolutely. This project started out when we had a postdoctoral scholar who was excited to move from our congressional work to the states. There is a lot of computer programming involved to scrape each state legislative data set for who are the members, what bills are they proposing, and then, yes, looking for keywords that indicate that that bill received a hearing or that bill had a vote, that bill moved forward in a variety of ways. So, yeah, lots involved there. And then a lot of, it helps to be at universities where there are active students who are excited to work on these projects, who can then dive in and say, okay, computer code gets us so far, but let's do a lot of double checking of what's going on here. And do we need to modify the language for New York compared to what we had been using in Virginia or Montana or wherever else?
Think you know Planet Albany? Then prove your stuff by joining our Fantasy Lawmaker League for 2026. You'll pick 6 state lawmakers and get points for movement on their legislation. But choose wisely, because inaction and vetoes will cost you points. So join the fun for free by January 16th and follow along all year long to see how you stack up against your fellow political nerds, with a chance to win bragging rights and an undisclosed prize. The link to join is in the podcast episode description and on our homepage at capitalpressroom.org. Some challenges need someone who simply won't quit. Modern advocacy brings tenacity, strategy, and unwavering follow-through to every client it serves. Learn more at modernadvocacyllc.com. Well, I'm definitely envious of the manpower you have as we embark on our Fantasy Lawmaker League. But I want to come back to the idea of effectiveness, because to me that means, say, a high batting average in addition to getting some stuff through. And there are members of the legislature who throw a lot of slop out there. It just languishes. And for our purposes, then, we're subtracting points for bills that don't move through a committee, and you lose even more points if your bill gets vetoed. Is that something that you took into consideration as part of this?
So we, just by our particular weighting scheme, we give a tiny little bit of credit for introducing bills because there are so many of them.
You get points just for introducing the bill.
It's a start. Right?
But even though like some of these bills have been kicking around for like 20 years and they just sort of do it as a matter of course, and you look at the bill text and it's like, boy, I don't even think this is like relevant to today's society. It's like it's like fax machine regulations.
So batting averages are interesting because we had found in Congress that some prior work that was looking just at batting averages found the person who introduced 2 bills and both of them became law and thought that's a tremendously effective lawmaker compared to the person that introduced 50 bills and 40 of them became law. They only had an 80% batting average, but ultimately they produced 20 times as much law. And so we wanted to take into consideration not just the rates, but the volume. And so to start with that volume, we start with the volume of bills, and you get a little bit of credit for that. But then it's ultimately not a batting average because they don't start with the same number of bats, I guess, is the way to think about that. And taking 2 lawmakers that both have 50% of their bills becoming law, we think the one that has more bills and thus more laws is a more effective lawmaker.
So here in New York, a ton of policy now gets shoved into our budget, and there's no single legislator who gets sort of credit for that, although lawmakers will see their bills essentially adopted into the budget process more and more frequently here in New York, despite the protestations of the Assembly Democratic majority. Is that something that was on your radar, and did you try to account for that at all? or was it just too challenging?
So this is increasingly on our radar. This is a process that similarly is done in Congress. They have these giant omnibus
Sure.
bills, your one big beautiful bill, and your National Defense Authorization Act that has all kinds of stuff incorporated in it. And just over the past few years in our scoring of Congress, which really go back more than a decade, but in the past few years, we've come up with a methodology to give people credit for their bills that get embedded elsewhere. Essentially, we take all of the language of all of the bills and compare it to all of the language of all of the laws we're at universities. So it's through plagiarism style software. And we see, did your bill text get embedded in some other piece of legislation? And we give members of Congress credit for that. And one thing that we found in Congress is now more bills become law through that kind of behind the scenes lawmaking than as standalone pieces of legislation. We're seeing that some states, not very many, but New York is one of them, have something similar emerging here. And so we're thinking about, can we port over that process that we're using in Congress to the states? We have not done that yet.
I would definitely recommend it, especially too, and we don't see this as much under Governor Kathy Hochul, but under Governor Cuomo, another thing we would see was sort of an end of session omnibus bill, as you mentioned, with like the one big beautiful bill. We would do what we would call a big ugly here at the end of the legislative session before lawmakers left. Another thing, in terms of weighting the substantive nature of bills, are you familiar with how bills can get laid aside, so to speak, in New York and then taken up on a controversial calendar? Because that is usually indicative of the fact that there was debate on a bill and that there might have been some sort of opposition. Or, I guess more simply, you could look at the vote tallies for bills, and if it passed more narrowly, that might suggest it was more substantive in nature, or at least more controversial and harder to get through the chambers. Is that something on your radar and something maybe your minions might be taking into consideration now or in the future?
Certainly something that we're interested in, the different processes that bills are going through. Likewise, we're interested in the idea about the nature of co-sponsorships and the degree to which members are co-sponsoring with members of the other party. And one thing that we found systematically, both in Congress and in the state legislatures, is that lawmakers who are more bipartisan, we measure that as the percent of their co-sponsors who are from the other party, they tend to be much more effective. And somewhat surprisingly, I mean, it's unsurprising that if you're in the minority party, you need majority party support. But somewhat surprisingly, members of the majority party, if they are more bipartisan in their co-sponsorships, are likewise more effective as lawmakers, according to our metric. And so if you wanted to do a behind the scenes, who's likely to be effective, well, let's look at who's likely to be bipartisan on that metric as an additional path forward.
So when I circulated your list of effective lawmakers, primarily on the Democratic side, to various stakeholders and people following the legislature, there were a couple head scratchers. One in the Senate was Cordell Clear making your top 10. I'm curious, have you gotten any feedback, for good or bad, on your rankings since they've come out, with people saying, hey, I should be higher, or, I can't believe that person's so high. Are you hearing from anybody?
So most of what we're getting is from insiders who know the legislature and are saying, debate a few of those, but overall, you're capturing what we would expect.
And just to be clear, you have Amy Paulin, Assembly member, as the most effective, and James Skoufis, I believe, most effective in the Senate, and there was pretty much no disagreement on that from people who actually know how Albany works. And actually, just to peel back the curtain on our Fantasy Lawmaker League, Paulin has been chosen so far by, I think, about 2/3 of participants for the category that she's in.
And we've had the pleasure to have done one of our conversations with Effective Lawmakers with her. If people want to go to our website and check that out as well. All of this is up on thelawmakers.org, where you can find out more. It is always fascinating to have the conversations with people who think they should be more highly ranked. And the nature of those conversations varies quite substantially. Often it is here's what we're doing that's so awesome that you're missing. And we're always open to those conversations since we're looking for ways to improve, and whether it's that behind the scenes lawmaking or something else. We kind of try to maneuver those conversations into, well, here's what we found that effective lawmakers actually do to offer advice to folks who want to be more effective. And so some of that, well, build out your coalitions and be more bipartisan. Something else that we found fairly systematically is pick an issue area or two and really specialize in that. Get to be the known as the go-to person on health or education or whatever it is, where you'll be involved in those substantive policy discussions and your legislation will be taken more seriously moving forward. And so those bits of advice that we can offer to folks who are wishing to perform more highly, or to freshman members who are looking for what's a good strategy to start on down the road. A couple pieces of advice there that we're able to offer. We also are trying to be very clear on what we do and do not cover here. So we're the Center for Effective Lawmaking, so we're looking at solely introducing bills that can become law. There are other tasks of legislators communicating and working with their districts in a variety of ways, stopping legislation.
That was one I was curious about.
Possibility.
Yes.
And I'd be curious how you're ranking that in your
I
approach
can't
as well.
think of a
really
good way to do that that's not going to be very time and reporting intensive.
Yeah. And we're in a similar boat. We want to be really objective and transparent in what our methodology is. And, we've found in Congress over time that there are folks who are known to stop legislation in the Senate with the filibuster and so on. And many of them are also highly effective in moving forward their own legislation, but it is a different task. Likewise, we don't characterize oversight, which is a good legislative function, and there are some other things that we leave behind.
And just to be clear, did you hear from any New York lawmakers who wanted to be a little higher or wanted a little more recognition this time around?
Not so far in New York, no.
Well, maybe after this airs, someone will look up and they'll be like, hey, how come I wasn't so high? Well, one that comes to mind, who actually speaks to what you talk about in terms of issue specialization, is Assemblymember Alex Borez, who has gotten some really high-profile stuff done in his first term and has continued that in his second term. And he ends up being, I think, number 2 for freshman assembly members, exceeding expectations. What about, though, something like getting money during the legislative session? Is that something that you are thinking about folding into this in the future? Who's able to bring back, say, grants to their district?
Yeah, we've been exploring that a little bit, more at the congressional level than at the state level. There is a bit more consistency and therefore transparency in how Congress counts along those lines than we have in many states. You might have better data in New York than in some others. One thing that we have found is that there's a correlation. The folks who are good at bringing back money are also good at lawmaking on average, but we haven't built it in to our scores directly.
Well, moving forward, are you looking to, or maybe you already do this in other states, partner with journalists or other insiders, so to speak, on collecting information? Because I think about something like bringing back the bacon, so to speak, and at the end of the year there's going to be resolutions that the Assembly is going to move that is going to have different, for lack of a better word, pork for their districts. And I know where that is. So do you envision partnering with people? Is that something you're interested in? Or do you want to try to keep it more academic focused and I guess more independent of other entities moving forward?
We do have a strong interest in partnering, both with journalists, with good governance organizations, and with the legislatures themselves. And those have come in a variety of ways as we've started rolling out these scores. So with journalists, some is just get the word out. Others are looking for patterns across states or over time that are tough for, journalists are in a great position to tell the in-depth story, but maybe a current snapshot. And it is helpful to have that broader clearer picture of, what was happening 10, 20 years ago, since our data go back in time, or how do these patterns in New York compare to patterns elsewhere? And then with a variety of good governance organizations and with the legislatures themselves, our main initiative is to get involved in some new member orientation activities and to help kind of freshman members and hit the ground running with some patterns that we know are helpful for effective lawmaking over time.
Okay, so I want to come back to the fantasy draft aspect of things, and we've been hearing from shrewd politicos who have noted that when it comes to Republicans, you want someone who represents a lot of counties because it means they'll have the most local bills. And as we talked about, those local bills could be something like, oh, we're going to name a section of the road after a fallen hero, but it can also mean something like a local tax extender. And I'm curious how you weighted something like that, because your top-rated Assembly Republican was Chris Tague, whose counties include, I need to take a deep breath for this, Albany, Columbia, Delaware, Greene, Otsego, Schoharie, and Ulster. And so he's going to have a lot of opportunity to do something like that. So did you factor in the nature of something like tax extenders, whether it's sales tax or hotel, motel occupancy? How did you think about something like that? And was that vast reach of some of these districts something that you saw play out for the Assembly and Senate?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how that plays out. And to an extent, it also depends on kind of the homogeneity of their districts from the point of view of if it's a really divided and contested set of issues at the local level, then sometimes the states don't want to get involved in them. They want them sorted out at the local level. One interesting finding that some scholars have come up with recently is the degree to which, we had that finding I described about bipartisan co-sponsors. There's also an element of geographic co-sponsors, right? Are you working only with people in your area, or are folks from rural areas working with those in urban areas, and so on? And just like bipartisan lawmakers tended to be more effective, we found that folks who build up coalitions across the urban rural divide are more effective also. And so just sort of the nature of what does it take for that local issue to pass in a state legislature, it varies so dramatically from state to state that sometimes okay, we'll just give you what you want because you've worked out that local coalition. But many times it's how can you put forward something that's also beneficial in our district? And sometimes those divides are quite extreme.
Did you have any interactions with the state legislature in terms of trying to collect data or get an understanding of how they operate? And if you did, what was that experience like? Because I think for a lot of reporters trying to cover the Capitol, if you're new to this, it can be kind of like a black box, and you can find that a lot of people aren't that interested in helping you and actually have an incentive to keep this process opaque. So did you interact with sort of the central institutions? And if you did, what was that experience like?
So certainly as we were first coming up with these scores, and we were doing that right in the pandemic era, we had a lot of email interactions with folks and so on, trying to figure out the details of, is this wording clearly representing a bill that's found its way to the floor? Is this wording properly capturing what a commemorative bill is in your state, and so on? And some of it is, how does the interface actually work? What does it mean to, have a bill substituted for another bill? And how do we make sure that we get credit for that? Our extreme case of that was not so much New York, but what was Kansas, where up until about 2 or 3 years ago, there was no way to trace who introduced a bill. In other words, bills were introduced, but people didn't attach their names to them. And as such, our methodology is all about, who introduced the bills and how far did they move through the process. And so we couldn't score members from Kansas. And in some ways, it sounded like that was designed to keep people from knowing too much. And so some of these transparency issues rose in Kansas, but are rising in a variety of other states about, how can we find out who's doing what and moving forward. And so most of the states are now in a position where It's not trivial to get the information, but we're able to start out by going to their websites and scraping all of that data and trying to make sense of it. And then part of our role is making it even more transparent, because all of our scores are up on our website now, and people can poke around, not just the recent data that we released for the 246th term, but going back in time as well and sort of seeing these. In the report that you were referring to, we like to highlight people who are in our exceeds expectations category. In other words, in addition to being, a sixth-term committee chair in the majority party, we expect them to have a high score. Do they dramatically outperform even relative to those high expectations? And people who outperform time and time again are on our top performers list for a long streak that they have there. Might be useful when you're thinking about who to pick moving forward, is not just their initial scores, but who has been a top performer over time.
And the website, if people are interested in doing a deep dive on the New York list, which we'll actually post a link to in this description, but if they want to explore the work you're doing more broadly, they should check out thelawmakers.org. Craig, I hope we can get you to maybe participate in our Fantasy Lawmaker League as well, and see if all this knowledge has prepared you to go up against the people who are living and breathing this stuff on a daily basis.
You'll see what a low performer academics are in the real world here, but we're happy to try to do our part. And in terms of these scores, our aspiration is to be able to release them again right after the end of every legislative term. It'll take us a couple months to get everything in order, but instead of having the kind of lag to previous years, we'll hope to get it clearly up to speed in the future.
Well, we've been speaking with Craig Volden. He is the co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking, as well as a professor at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at UVA. Craig, this has been a lot of fun, and we'll have to check in with you further on down the road to see how your analysis looks like.
Fantastic. Great to be with you, David.